Picture this, you're standing at the altar, your heart beating so loudly you're sure everyone can hear it. The man you've chosen to spend your life with is smiling at you with such tenderness, such certainty. Your hands are trembling beneath the lace of your grandmother's gloves. The church is filled with everyone you love, everyone who matters. You're 30 seconds away from saying, "I do," when you see him. 20 years. 20 years since he vanished from your life without explanation, without goodbye, without a trace. And now he's here, standing at the back of the church like a ghost made flesh, like every prayer you were afraid to whisper and every dream you forced yourself to forget. What would you do? What would any of us do when the past collides with the present so violently that the future suddenly becomes impossible to see? This is Sarah's story. And it begins with the most beautiful morning that became the most impossible day of her life. Part 1. The wedding day. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Cathedral like liquid gold, painting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews that had witnessed 100 years of promises, of beginnings, of forevers. Sarah Catherine Williams stood before the full-length mirror in the bride's preparation room, her reflection almost ethereal in the soft light that seemed to bless everything it touched. Her wedding dress was poetry written in silk and lace. It had belonged to her grandmother, then her mother, and now it embraced Sarah like a gentle embrace from generations of love. The bodice fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting 32 years for her to fill it. The train spread behind her like spilled moonlight, and the veil, oh, the veil, cascaded from a crown of seed pearls that caught the morning sun and threw it back in tiny, dancing stars. "You look like an angel," whispered her sister Emma, her matron of honor, as she fastened the final button along Sarah's spine. Emma's voice was thick with tears she was trying not to shed. Mom would be so proud. Sarah's mother had passed 3 years ago, and her absence was both a gentle ache and a comforting presence. Sarah could almost feel her there, in the way the light fell across her shoulders, in the familiar weight of the family pearls around her neck, in the way everything felt both ancient and brand new. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's began their slow, ceremonial call, each chime reverberating through Sarah's chest like a heartbeat. In just 30 minutes, she would walk down that aisle. In 30 minutes, she would take Michael's hand and promise him forever. Michael Harrison, kind, steady, dependable Michael who brought her coffee every morning and left little notes in her lunchbox. Michael who held her when she cried about her mother, who painted their bedroom yellow because he knew it was her favorite color, who proposed on Christmas morning with her grandmother's engagement ring because he said some love deserves to be honored by history. "Are you nervous?" Emma asked, adjusting the delicate straps of Sarah's dress. Sarah smiled, and it was genuine, peaceful. "No," she said softly. "I'm ready. I've never been more ready for anything in my life." And she meant it. At 32, Sarah had learned what love really meant. Not the desperate, consuming passion of youth, but something steadier, something that felt like coming home. Michael was her harbor after years of storms she thought she'd never survive. With him, she felt safe. With him, she felt known. With him, the future stretched out clear and bright and beautifully ordinary. The bridal party began to gather. Emma, her cousin Rachel who lived in Portland and had flown in just for this day, and her best friend Jessica who had been planning this wedding almost as eagerly as Sarah herself. They were all in dusty rose, a color that complemented the autumn light and made them look like they'd stepped out of an old photograph, timeless and lovely. Downstairs, Sarah could hear the guests beginning to arrive. The gentle murmur of voices, the soft padding of feet across stone floors, the occasional burst of laughter from someone greeting an old friend. 300 people had been invited. 300 people who had loved and supported Sarah and Michael through the 3 years of their courtship, through the engagement, through the careful, joyful planning of this day. Michael's parents had driven down from Boston, his mother clutching a handkerchief that had belonged to her own grandmother. His college friends had flown in from as far as California, men who still called him Mickey and who remembered when he was too shy to talk to girls, who marveled now at the confident, gentle man he'd become. Sarah's colleagues from the elementary school where she taught had taken the day off, excited to see their beloved third-grade teacher become Mrs. Harrison. "15 minutes," called Father McKenna through the door, his Irish accent warm with affection. He had baptized Sarah 32 years ago, had given her first communion, had held her hands when her father died and again when her mother followed. Today, he would give her away to Michael, would bless their union, would speak the ancient words that would make them husband and wife. Sarah's hands found her bouquet, white roses and baby's breath, simple and classic, wrapped in her grandmother's lace handkerchief. She breathed in their scent, closed her eyes, and made a small prayer of gratitude. For this day. For Michael. For the beautiful, ordinary life they were about to begin together. Take a moment and think about your own love story. Have you ever felt that kind of peace, that certainty that you're exactly where you're supposed to be? Drop a comment and tell us about a moment when everything felt perfectly right. And if this story is touching your heart already, hit that like button. We promise it's just the beginning. Through the window, Sarah could see the last of the guests hurrying up the stone steps of the cathedral. Mrs. Peterson from next door, still spry at 85. The mailman, Joe, who Michael had insisted they invite because he always asked about the wedding. Sarah's old college roommate who'd driven 6 hours just to be there. The music began, soft, processional, the notes floating up from the sanctuary like incense. Sarah felt her heart quicken, not with nerves but with joy. This was it. This was her moment. Her forever was about to begin. Emma adjusted Sarah's veil one last time, kissed her cheek gently. "Ready, beautiful?" Sarah nodded, took one last look in the mirror, and smiled at the woman looking back at her. She looked radiant, peaceful, complete. She looked like a bride who had found her home. "I'm ready," she whispered. And she walked toward the door, toward the aisle, toward Michael, toward the beautiful life that was waiting for her just beyond those heavy wooden doors. She had no idea that in less than 10 minutes, everything she thought she knew about love, about herself, about the past she'd carefully buried, would be turned upside down by the appearance of a man she thought she'd never see again. Part 2, 20 years ago. To understand what happened next, we have to go back. Back 20 years, when Sarah was 12 years old and Daniel McKinley was the boy who lived 3 houses down and understood her in ways that made her feel like she'd found her other half before she even knew she was incomplete. Sarah Catherine Williams at 12 was all knees and elbows and wild auburn hair that refused to stay in braids. She was the girl who climbed trees to read books, who collected bottle caps and pressed flowers, who believed in magic because how else could you explain the way dandelion seeds knew exactly where to land to become new flowers? Daniel McKinley was 13, dark-haired and serious, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a smile that appeared so rarely it felt like a gift when it came. He was the boy who moved to Millbrook with his mother after his father died, who was too quiet in class but brilliant in ways that made teachers shake their heads in wonder. He was the boy who noticed that Sarah read during recess and began bringing his own books to sit beside her under the old oak tree. They became inseparable the way only children can, completely, unself-consciously, with the kind of friendship that felt inevitable, like they'd been meant to find each other. Daniel helped Sarah with math, Sarah helped Daniel talk to other kids. They built forts in the woods behind Sarah's house, caught fireflies in mason jars, made up elaborate stories about the people they'd be when they grew up. "I'm going to be a writer," Daniel told her one summer evening when they were 14 and 15, lying on their backs in Sarah's backyard, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "I'm going to write stories about people like us. People who feel too much, who see magic in ordinary things." "What kind of stories?" Sarah asked, turning on her side to look at him. At 15, Daniel was no longer the awkward boy who'd moved to town 3 years ago. He was becoming something else, tall and thoughtful and devastatingly handsome in a way that made Sarah's heart do strange, fluttering things she didn't quite understand. "Love stories," he said simply. "But not the easy kind. The kind where people have to choose between what they want and what they think they should want. The kind where love isn't enough but somehow has to be." Sarah felt something shift between them in that moment, something that changed the very air they breathed. They weren't just friends anymore, though they pretended to be for several more months. They weren't just kids, though they tried to hold on to childhood as long as they could. By the time Sarah turned 16, they weren't pretending anymore. Their first kiss happened during a thunderstorm in September, when they were caught in the woods and took shelter in the old abandoned cabin they'd claimed as their own years before. Sarah was shivering, not from cold, but from the electricity in the air, from the way Daniel was looking at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask. "Sarah," he whispered, and her name in his voice was a prayer, a promise, a question all at once. When their lips met, it was nothing like the clumsy kisses she'd imagined. It was soft and sweet and certain, like coming home and setting off on an adventure at the same time. It was the kiss she would measure every other kiss against for the rest of her life. They were together through the rest of high school, not just boyfriend and girlfriend, but soulmates in the truest sense. They wrote each other letters even though they saw each other every day. They planned their future with the confidence of people who had never known heartbreak, who believed that love like theirs was strong enough to overcome anything. Daniel was going to study English at the state university. Sarah would study elementary education at the same school. They would get married after graduation, buy a little house with a big yard, have 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, and grow old together reading books under that same oak tree where they'd first become friends. It was a beautiful plan. It was a perfect plan. It lasted until 3 weeks before graduation. Sarah remembered that day with the kind of painful clarity that comes with trauma, every detail preserved like insects in amber. It was a Tuesday in May, warm and bright, the kind of day that made you believe in second chances and happy endings. She was in calculus class, daydreaming about the prom dress she and Daniel had picked out together, pale blue, simple and elegant, the kind of dress you wore when you were 17 and believed in forever. The knock on the classroom door was soft, almost apologetic. Mrs. Henderson, the school secretary, whispered something to Mr. Garcia that made his face go serious and sad. He nodded toward Sarah. "Sarah Williams? Could you step into the hallway, please?" Her first thought was that something had happened to her parents. Her second thought was Daniel. By the time she reached the hallway and saw Mrs. Henderson's face, her heart was already breaking. "Honey," Mrs. Henderson said gently, taking Sarah's hands in her own, "Daniel McKinley won't be coming back to school. His mother, they've had to leave town. Very suddenly. I'm so sorry." The world tilted sideways. "What do you mean, leave town? Leave for where? When are they coming back?" Mrs. Henderson's face was full of pity and something else, something that looked like fear. "I don't know, sweetheart. I don't think they're coming back." Sarah ran. She ran from the school, ran the 8 blocks to Daniel's house, ran until her lungs burned and her legs shook. The house was empty. Not just empty, stripped. No furniture in the windows, no car in the driveway, no sign that anyone had ever lived there at all. She pounded on the door until her knuckles bled. She called Daniel's name until her voice gave out. She sat on the front porch and waited until the sun set and Mrs. Peterson from across the street came to take her home. Daniel McKinley had vanished. Completely, utterly, without explanation or goodbye or forwarding address. It was as if he'd never existed at all, except for the hole in Sarah's heart that felt big enough to swallow the whole world. Sarah spent the next 6 months trying to find him. She called information in every state, wrote letters to every McKinley in every phone book she could get her hands on. She hired a private investigator with money from her summer job, a kind man who took her case for almost nothing and spent 3 months searching before gently telling her that some people simply don't want to be found. The not knowing was the worst part. Was he dead? Was he in witness protection? Had he left voluntarily, or had something terrible happened? Had he ever loved her at all, or had she imagined the whole thing? By the time Sarah left for college, not the state university where they'd planned to go together, but a small school 3 states away where no one knew her story, she had built walls around her heart so high and so thick that she convinced herself they were permanent. She dated in college, even fell in love once or twice, but it was different. Careful. Guarded. She had learned that people could disappear, that love wasn't always enough, that sometimes the most important question wasn't whether someone loved you, but whether they would stay. If you've ever lost someone who meant everything to you, you know this kind of pain. It's the kind that changes you, that teaches you to love differently, more carefully. Share this video with someone who understands that kind of heartbreak. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in our pain is the first step toward healing. Sarah built a good life despite the Daniel-shaped hole in her heart. She became a teacher, just as she'd planned. She bought a little house with a garden where she grew the flowers her mother had taught her to love. She made friends, joined committees, learned to be happy in a way that didn't depend on anyone else. And then, at a coffee shop on a rainy Thursday morning 3 years ago, she met Michael. Kind, gentle Michael who didn't try to rush her walls down but simply waited patiently for her to lower them herself. Michael who loved her completely without needing to know every story that had made her who she was. With Michael, Sarah learned that there were different kinds of love. Not the desperate, all-consuming passion of youth, but something steadier, something that felt like safety and home and the promise of ordinary happiness. It wasn't the love she'd had with Daniel. Nothing could ever be that again, but it was real and good and enough. More than enough. She said yes when Michael proposed because she meant it. She planned their wedding with joy because she was genuinely happy. She walked toward that altar with a heart full of gratitude for the second chance at love she'd never thought she'd find. She had made peace with the past. She had buried Daniel McKinley so deep in her heart that she genuinely believed he would stay buried forever. She was wrong. Part 3, the arrival. The processional music swelled as Sarah stepped into the doorway of the sanctuary, her arm linked through her Uncle Robert's. He would walk her down the aisle since her father wasn't there to do it, and she could feel him trembling slightly, with emotion or nerves, she wasn't sure which. The cathedral was breathtaking. 300 faces turned toward her, all smiling, all radiant with joy and love and celebration. The afternoon light streamed through the stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the stone floors and wooden pews. White roses and baby's breath adorned every surface, their scent mixing with the faint smell of old wood and candle wax that made every church feel timeless and sacred. And there, at the altar, stood Michael. Michael in his charcoal gray tuxedo with the pale blue tie that matched his eyes. Michael with his gentle smile and his steady hands and his look of absolute adoration as he watched her walk toward him. Michael, who represented everything good and safe and beautiful about the life she'd chosen. Sarah felt her heart swell with love and gratitude and certainty. This was right. This was perfect. This was exactly where she was supposed to be. She took her first step down the aisle, then her second. The music wrapped around her like a blessing. Emma walked behind her, adjusting her train, making sure every detail was perfect. The photographer moved silently along the edges of the sanctuary, capturing moments that would become treasured memories. Sarah smiled at the faces in the crowd, her college roommate in the third row, her fellow teachers clustered together on the left side, Michael's family beaming with pride and welcome. Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Father McKenna stood ready at the altar, his liturgy book open, his face warm with the particular joy that comes from witnessing love being celebrated. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was perfectly, beautifully ordinary in the way that the most important moments often are. Sarah was halfway down the aisle when she saw him. At first, her brain couldn't process what her eyes were telling her. It was impossible. It was a trick of light, a wedding day hallucination brought on by emotion and adrenaline and the overwhelming magnitude of the moment. But no. Daniel McKinley stood at the very back of the cathedral, half hidden in the shadows of the last pew. 20 years older, but unmistakably, undeniably him. The same dark hair, though now touched with silver at the temples. The same storm-gray eyes that had once looked at her like she was the answer to every question that mattered. The same face that had haunted her dreams for years before she finally learned to stop dreaming about him at all. He was wearing a dark suit that looked expensive, understated. His hands were clasped in front of him, and he was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read, pain, regret, longing, apology, all mixed together into something that made her chest tighten until she couldn't breathe. The music continued. Her feet continued moving forward, carrying her toward Michael and the altar and the life she'd chosen. But her eyes were locked on Daniel, and suddenly she was 17 again, sitting on his empty front porch, waiting for an explanation that never came. How long had he been there? Had he been there for the entire ceremony? Had he watched her process down the aisle, watched her smile at the guests, watched her move toward a future that didn't include him? Sarah's step faltered. Just slightly, but enough that Uncle Robert glanced at her with concern. "You okay, sweetheart?" he whispered. She nodded, forced herself to look away from Daniel, to focus on Michael's face. Michael, who was watching her with such love, such trust, such complete faith in what they were building together. Michael, who had no idea that the ghost from her past was standing in his church, at his wedding, looking at his bride like she was a piece of his soul that had been lost and found again. But her eyes betrayed her. They drifted back to Daniel, and this time he was looking directly at her. Not at the beautiful bride in the antique dress, not at the fairy tale wedding happening around them, but at her. At Sarah. At the girl who had loved him with everything she had and had never gotten to say goodbye. Their eyes met across 20 years and 300 wedding guests and a lifetime of carefully constructed distance. For just a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. There was no wedding, no Michael, no church full of people expecting her to say, "I do," in less than 5 minutes. There was just Sarah and Daniel and the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between them. Daniel's lips moved, forming a single word she couldn't hear but could read as clearly as if he'd shouted it, "Sarah." Her name in his mouth was an apology, a question, a prayer, a goodbye all at once. It was the explanation she'd waited 20 years to hear, even if she couldn't actually hear it. And then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked out of the cathedral. Sarah watched him go, watched the heavy wooden doors close behind him, watched the shadow that had haunted half her life disappear once again into whatever darkness had kept him hidden for 2 decades. The music swelled. Uncle Robert's grip on her arm tightened gently, encouraging her forward. Michael was still smiling, still waiting, still believing that in 30 seconds he would marry the woman who loved him completely and without reservation. Sarah forced herself to breathe, to smile, to continue walking toward the altar. But her heart was hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Her hands were shaking so violently that her bouquet trembled like leaves in a storm. By the time she reached the altar, by the time Uncle Robert kissed her cheek and placed her hand in Michael's, by the time Father McKenna began the ancient, beautiful words that would bind her to the man she'd chosen to love, Daniel was gone. But the questions he'd brought with him remained. Why now? Why today? Where had he been for 20 years? What had happened to make him and his mother disappear so completely, so suddenly? And why, God help her, why, did seeing him again feel like a key turning in a lock she'd convinced herself didn't exist anymore? "Dearly beloved," Father McKenna began, his voice warm and ceremonial, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Sarah Catherine Williams and Michael James Harrison in holy matrimony." Sarah heard the words as if from a great distance. She felt Michael's hands holding hers, steady and sure. She saw the faces of their friends and family, all glowing with happiness and expectation. But part of her, a part she'd thought was dead and buried, was running toward those cathedral doors, chasing the ghost who had just walked out of her wedding and back into the carefully ordered life she'd built without him. What would you do? If the love you thought you'd lost forever appeared at the moment you were about to promise your life to someone else, what would you do? The comment section is where we share our hearts. Tell us about a time when your past collided with your present in a way that changed everything. And if you're feeling the weight of this moment with Sarah, hit that subscribe button because stories like this are what we're here for, the complicated, beautiful, impossible moments that make us most human. Marriage, Father McKenna continued, is a sacred bond, not to be entered into lightly, but with full knowledge of its significance and with the love and support of family and friends. Sarah tried to focus on the words, on Michael's face, on the commitment she was about to make. But her mind kept replaying that moment when Daniel's eyes had met hers across the cathedral. In that look, she'd seen everything they'd once been to each other and everything they'd never gotten the chance to become. If anyone here has reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace. The silence that followed felt endless, heavy with possibility and fear. Sarah's heart stopped beating entirely as she waited, for what, she didn't know. For Daniel to come bursting back through those doors. For her own voice to find the courage to stop everything. But the silence held. Daniel was gone. The moment passed. Father McKenna smiled and continued, Michael and Sarah have written their own vows to express their love and commitment to each other. This was it. This was the moment when she would speak the promises she'd written with such joy and certainty just 3 weeks ago. Words about love and faithfulness and choosing each other every day for the rest of their lives. Michael spoke first, his voice clear and strong and full of love. Sarah, 3 years ago you walked into my life and taught me what it meant to find my home in another person. You are my safe harbor, my greatest adventure, my most cherished friend. I promise to love you in good times and bad, in sickness and health, in joy and sorrow. I promise to be your partner, your protector, your greatest supporter. I promise to choose you, every day, for the rest of my life. The words were beautiful. They were true. They were everything Sarah had hoped to hear from the man she was marrying. So why did they feel like they were being spoken to someone else? Why did every promise feel like a door closing on something she'd convinced herself she no longer wanted? Now it was her turn. 300 people waited to hear her speak words of love and commitment to the good, kind man who adored her. The man who deserved her whole heart, her complete devotion, her undivided future. Sarah opened her mouth to speak the vows she'd memorized, the promises she'd written with such certainty and joy. But all she could think about was Daniel's face in the shadows of the cathedral. All she could hear was her own 17-year-old voice, making different promises to a different boy under a different sky, forever, Danny. No matter what happens, it's going to be forever. Part 4, The Choice, Sarah. Father McKenna's voice was gentle, concerned. Your vows, dear. Sarah looked at Michael, sweet, patient Michael who was gazing at her with such love and trust and complete faith in what they were building together. Behind him, she could see their friends and family, all leaning forward slightly, all waiting to hear her speak words that would seal their future together. The cathedral felt enormous and impossibly small at the same time. The weight of 300 pairs of eyes, the expectation hanging in the perfumed air, the gravity of promises that were meant to last a lifetime, it all pressed down on her until she felt like she might shatter under the pressure. She began, then stopped. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. Michael squeezed her hands gently, encouragingly. His smile was patient, understanding. He thought she had wedding nerves, stage fright, the completely normal overwhelm of standing before God and everyone you love and making the biggest promise of your life. He had no idea that his bride was falling apart for reasons that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with a ghost who had just walked out of their wedding as mysteriously as he had once walked out of her life. Take your time, sweetheart, Michael whispered, so softly that only she could hear. We have forever. Forever. The word hit her like a physical blow. Forever was what she had promised Daniel when they were teenagers who believed in happy endings and love that conquered all. Forever was what she had been prepared to promise Michael just 5 minutes ago, before her carefully constructed present collided with her unresolved past. Sarah closed her eyes for just a moment, trying to center herself, trying to find the words she had written with such certainty just 3 weeks ago. Words about choosing Michael every day, about building a life together, about love that was steady and sure and strong enough to weather any storm. But when she opened her eyes, all she could see was Daniel's face in the shadows of the cathedral. All she could think about was the way he had looked at her, not with the desperate passion of youth, but with something deeper. Recognition. Regret. The weight of 20 years of unfinished business. Sarah, She began again, then stopped. Because suddenly, horribly, she realized she couldn't do it. She couldn't stand there and promise Michael forever when part of her heart, a part she'd thought was dead and buried, had just been resurrected by a single look from the boy who had been her first everything. It wasn't fair to Michael. It wasn't fair to herself. And it certainly wasn't fair to Daniel, who had appeared and disappeared again like smoke, leaving her with nothing but questions and a terrible knowledge that she had never really gotten over him at all. "I'm sorry," she whispered, so quietly that only Michael could hear. "I'm so sorry." And then, before she could lose her courage, before she could think about what she was doing, before she could consider the consequences or the embarrassment or the 300 people who had come to celebrate what they thought was her happily ever after, Sarah let go of Michael's hands. She turned, her grandmother's wedding dress rustling against the stone floor, and walked, quickly, purposefully, desperately, back down the aisle she had just walked up with such joy and certainty. The cathedral erupted in confused murmurs. She heard Michael call her name behind her, heard Father McKenna's shocked, "Sarah, wait," heard Emma's heels clicking on stone as her sister tried to follow her. But Sarah didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She pushed through the heavy wooden doors and out into the late afternoon sunshine, her veil streaming behind her like the train of a comet, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Daniel was there. Of course he was there. He was leaning against a lamppost across the street from the cathedral, smoking a cigarette with the kind of nervous energy that comes from making impossible decisions. When he saw her burst through the cathedral doors, he dropped the cigarette and straightened, his face cycling through shock, hope, fear, and something that might have been relief. They stared at each other across 20 years and one empty street. Sarah in her grandmother's wedding dress, her veil askew, her bouquet forgotten somewhere in the cathedral behind her. Daniel in his expensive suit, looking like a successful stranger except for his eyes, which were exactly the same as they had been when he was 17 and she was 16 and they had believed in forever. "You came," he said when she reached him, when she had somehow crossed the street without remembering moving her feet. His voice was different, deeper, rougher, worn by years and experiences she knew nothing about. But underneath the changes, she could still hear the boy who had once whispered her name like a prayer. "You left," she said simply. 20 years of questions compressed into 2 words. Daniel nodded, his face crumpling with pain and regret. "I had to. God, Sarah, I had to. I wanted to explain, wanted to say goodbye, but there wasn't time. There was never enough time." 20 years, Sarah said. 20 years, Daniel. Do you have any idea what that did to me? Do you know how long I waited for you to come back, to call, to send a letter, to give me any sign that what we had meant something to you? Tears were streaming down her face now, 20 years of buried grief and anger and love pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. She was dimly aware that people were beginning to emerge from the cathedral, Michael, Emma, Father McKenna, guests who were trying to figure out what had just happened to the wedding they had come to celebrate. But she couldn't think about that now. She could only think about Daniel, about the explanations she had needed for half her lifetime. "It meant everything," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "Sarah, it meant everything. Not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about you, haven't wondered what you were doing, haven't regretted the way I had to leave." "Had to?" Sarah's voice was sharp, angry. "You didn't have to disappear without a word. You didn't have to let me think you were dead or that I had imagined everything between us. You chose to leave me with nothing." Daniel ran his hands through his hair, the same gesture he had made as a teenager when he was trying to find the right words for something important. "My mother," he said finally. "My mother was in witness protection. My father didn't die in an accident like we told everyone. He was murdered because he testified against some very dangerous people. We had new identities, new lives, but someone found us. We had 2 hours to pack and disappear. 2 hours, Sarah. I couldn't even call you because they said any contact with our old life would put you in danger too." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Witness protection. Murder. Danger. All the romantic scenarios she had imagined, that Daniel had been kidnapped, or had amnesia, or had been forced to leave against his will, had been replaced by something far more serious and terrifying than her 17-year-old imagination could have conceived. 20 years, she whispered again, but this time it wasn't an accusation. It was mourning for all the time they had lost, all the explanations that had come too late, all the love that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond their control. "I looked for you," Daniel said softly. "As soon as I turned 18 and could make my own decisions, I tried to find you. But you had moved away for college, and then your family moved too, and by the time I tracked down your new address, you were engaged to someone else. I saw the announcement in your college newspaper. You looked so happy, Sarah. You looked like you had moved on, built a good life. I thought you were better off without me." "I was never better off without you," Sarah said, the words torn from someplace deep in her chest. "I built a life, yes. A good life. But there was always a Daniel-shaped hole in it. There was always something missing." They stood there in the fading afternoon light, two people who had loved each other completely and lost each other completely, trying to make sense of 20 years of separation and the impossible coincidence that had brought them back together on what was supposed to be Sarah's wedding day. Behind them, Sarah could hear Michael's voice, calling her name, asking if she was okay, if she needed help. Sweet, kind Michael, who deserved so much better than a bride who had run out on their wedding to chase a ghost from her past. "Sarah." Daniel's voice was urgent now, desperate. "I know I have no right to ask this. I know I gave up any claim to you 20 years ago when I disappeared from your life. But seeing you today, seeing you about to marry someone else, I couldn't just let you go again without telling you the truth. Without telling you that I never stopped loving you." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across 20 years of silence. Sarah felt her heart breaking and healing at the same time, felt the carefully constructed walls around her emotions crumbling like sand castles hit by a wave. "I was happy," she said, and realized as she said it that she was using the past tense. "I am happy. Michael is a good man. He loves me. We have a life together, plans, a future that makes sense." "But?" Daniel asked softly, because there was a "but" hanging in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. Sarah looked back at the cathedral, where she could see Michael standing in the doorway, his face a mask of confusion and hurt and dawning understanding. Emma was beside him, her hand on his arm, probably trying to convince him to give Sarah space to figure out whatever was happening. 300 wedding guests were waiting inside for her to return, to explain, to either continue with the ceremony or officially call it off. The photographer was probably wondering whether to keep shooting or pack up his equipment. The caterers were waiting at the reception venue, the band was setting up, the cake was being kept fresh in its refrigerated display. An entire day, an entire future, an entire life hung in the balance of what she said next. "But," Sarah said finally, the word barely a whisper, "seeing you again, it's like waking up from a dream I didn't know I was having. For 20 years, I convinced myself that what we had was just young love, just the intensity of being 17 and thinking everything lasts forever. I told myself that real love was what I have with Michael, steady, safe, predictable." She paused, tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking with the weight of 20 years of suppressed truth. "But standing there at that altar, looking at your face in the shadows, I realized I've been living half a life. I realized that part of me has been waiting, always waiting, for you to come back and finish what we started." Daniel stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, different from what he used to wear, more expensive, but underneath it she could still catch the scent that was uniquely him, the one that used to cling to his letters and his jacket and make her feel safe and loved and completely known. "Sarah," he said, and her name in his voice was every love song she'd ever heard, every poem she'd ever read, every prayer she'd ever whispered into the darkness. "I know I have no right to ask you to choose me. I know I lost that right when I disappeared. But I'm asking anyway, because I'm selfish and desperate and I've spent 20 years regretting that I never fought for us." "What are you asking me exactly?" Sarah's voice was stronger now, clearer. She needed to hear him say it, needed to understand exactly what choice she was being asked to make. I'm asking you to give us another chance. I'm asking you to walk away from that wedding, from that life you've planned, and take a leap of faith with me. I can't promise it will be easy, I can't even promise it will work. 20 years is a long time. We're different people now. But I'm asking you to try, because some love is worth the risk. The silence that followed was deafening. Behind them, Sarah could hear Michael approaching, his footsteps slow and reluctant on the pavement. She turned to see him walking toward them, still in his wedding tuxedo, his face a careful mask that didn't quite hide his heartbreak. Sarah, Michael said when he reached them, his voice carefully controlled. Do you need more time? We can postpone the ceremony if you need to. He trailed off as he took in the scene properly, Sarah in her wedding dress, tears streaming down her face, standing impossibly close to a stranger who was looking at her like she was the answer to every question that mattered. A stranger who was obviously not a stranger at all. This is him, isn't it? Michael asked quietly. This is Daniel. Sarah had never told Michael Daniel's name, had never shared the details of her first love. But she had told him that there had been someone, long ago, who had broken her heart so completely that it had taken years to trust love again. Michael was smart enough to put the pieces together. Yes, Sarah said simply. There was no point in lying now, no point in pretending this was anything other than what it was, a collision between past and present that was going to change everything, no matter what she chose. Michael nodded slowly, his hands clenched at his sides. And you're choosing him? It wasn't a question. Michael had seen the way Sarah was looking at Daniel, had heard the weight of 20 years in their conversation, had understood that sometimes love isn't about who loves you best or who deserves you most, but about who owns the pieces of your soul that you can never quite get back. Michael, Sarah started, but he held up a hand to stop her. Don't, he said quietly. Don't apologize. Don't try to explain. Don't make this harder than it already is. He stepped closer, took her hands one last time, looked into her eyes with a sadness that would haunt her forever. I love you, he said simply. I love you enough to want you to be completely happy, even if that happiness doesn't include me. I love you enough to let you go. And then he did something that proved exactly why she had fallen in love with him in the first place, why she had been ready to spend her life with him just 30 minutes ago. He kissed her forehead gently, like a blessing, like a goodbye, like forgiveness all wrapped into one tender gesture. Be happy, Sarah, he whispered. Whatever you choose, be happy. He turned and walked back toward the cathedral, toward the difficult task of explaining to 300 guests that there would be no wedding today, that sometimes love means knowing when to hold on and when to let go. Sarah watched him go, her heart breaking for the good man she was hurting, for the life they had planned together, for the simple happiness she was walking away from. You don't have to do this, Daniel said softly beside her. If you've changed your mind, if you realize that what you have with him is what you really want, I'll disappear again. I'll go back to whatever life I've been living and I won't bother you again. Sarah turned to look at him, really look at him. This man who had been a boy when she loved him first, who had grown into someone she didn't know but whose eyes still held all the secrets they had shared. This man who had broken her heart by leaving and was now asking her to trust him not to do it again. Where have you been? She asked. What kind of life have you built? Are you married? Do you have children? Do you have someone waiting for you somewhere? Daniel shook his head. No wife. No children. I've had relationships, but nothing that lasted. Nothing that could compete with the memory of loving you. He paused, running his hand through his hair again. I'm a writer, like I always said I would be. I've published 4 novels under a pen name. I live in Seattle, in a house overlooking the water. It's a good life, but it's a lonely one. It's been a lonely one since the day I lost you. What's your pen name? Sarah asked, because somehow this detail mattered, because she wanted to know if she had ever read his words without knowing they were his. James Morrison, Daniel said. My books are love stories, like I told you they would be. Stories about people who lose each other and find each other again. Stories about second chances and the courage it takes to believe in love after it's broken your heart. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went deeper than memory. I know your books, she said slowly. I've read all of them. They're some of my favorites. Daniel's face lit up with something between surprise and joy. You read them? Every one. I never knew. I felt something familiar in them, something that reminded me of conversations we used to have, but I never imagined. She trailed off, staring at him with new understanding. You've been writing about us. About us. About what we lost. About what I hoped we might find again someday. Daniel's voice was soft, vulnerable. Every love story I've ever written has been trying to get back to you. Think about the books that have changed your life, the stories that seem to speak directly to your soul. Sometimes the universe connects us in ways we never expect. If this story is touching something deep in your heart, hit that like button and let us know in the comments. Have you ever discovered that someone from your past had been reaching out to you in ways you never realized? The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street. Soon, it would be dark. Soon, Sarah would have to make a choice that would determine the shape of the rest of her life. If I come with you, she said carefully, if I choose this, choose us. What happens next? We can't just pick up where we left off 20 years ago. We're different people now. We don't really know each other anymore. Then we start over, Daniel said simply. We learn each other again. We date, like normal adults who are falling in love for the first time. We take it slow, we take it careful, we see if what we had as kids can grow into something real and lasting as adults. And if it doesn't work? If we discover that what we're chasing is just a memory, just the ghost of young love? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Then at least we'll know, he said finally. At least we won't spend the rest of our lives wondering, what if? At least we won't be two old people sitting in rocking chairs, regretting the chances we were too scared to take. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to envision her future. She could see herself back in the cathedral, apologizing to Michael, finishing the ceremony, going through with the wedding. She could see their life together, comfortable, predictable, safe. She could see herself as a good wife, a devoted partner, a woman who had made a practical choice and learned to be content with it. But she could also see herself 20 years from now, reading James Morrison novels and feeling that familiar pang of recognition, wondering if Daniel ever thought about her, wondering what would have happened if she had been brave enough to take the leap. She opened her eyes and looked at Daniel, this man who had been the love of her youth and might, just might, be the love of her lifetime. I'm scared, she said honestly. I'm terrified. I just left a good man at the altar. I just walked away from a life I spent 3 years building. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm scared too, Daniel admitted. I'm scared that 20 years is too long, that we've changed too much, that what we're feeling is just nostalgia. I'm scared that I'm being selfish, that I'm asking you to give up something real for something that might just be a beautiful dream. They stood there in the gathering dusk, two people balanced on the knife's edge between past and future, between safety and risk, between the life that made sense and the love that had never made sense but had always felt like destiny. But, Daniel continued, his voice stronger now, more certain, I'm more scared of walking away again. I'm more scared of living the rest of my life knowing that I found you and let you go twice. Sarah felt something settle inside her chest, a calm that came from finally knowing, with absolute certainty, what she needed to do. She reached up and pulled the pins from her veil, letting it fall to the pavement like a discarded dream. She slipped off her grandmother's engagement ring, the ring that Michael had given her, the ring that belonged to a different life, and held it in her palm for a moment before slipping it into the small pocket of her wedding dress. I choose you, she said simply. I choose us. I choose the risk and the uncertainty and the possibility that some love is worth waiting 20 years for." Daniel's face transformed, years of regret and longing replaced by hope and joy and something that looked like relief. He reached for her hands, held them carefully, like he was afraid she might disappear if he held on too tightly. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Are you absolutely sure? Because once we do this, once we walk away together, there's no going back." Sarah looked one last time at the cathedral, where the lights were now on in the windows, where people were probably still trying to figure out what had happened, where Michael was probably fielding questions and making explanations and handling the aftermath of her choice with the grace and dignity that had made her love him in the first place. She felt a stab of pain for the hurt she had caused, for the life she was abandoning, for the man who deserved better than a bride who couldn't give him her whole heart. But underneath the pain was something else, a sense of rightness, of coming home, of finally being brave enough to choose the love that had shaped her even when she thought it was gone forever. "I'm sure," she said. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Daniel smiled then, the first real smile she had seen from him since he appeared in the cathedral. It was the same smile that had made her 17-year-old heart skip beats, but it was different too, deeper, more complex, marked by years and experience and loss and the particular joy that comes from finding something precious that you thought was lost forever. "So what now?" Sarah asked. "Where do we go from here?" "Now," Daniel said, taking her hand and leading her away from the cathedral, away from the life she was leaving behind, toward whatever came next, "now we write a new story. Together." They walked into the gathering darkness, two people who had loved each other as children and were brave enough to see if they could love each other as adults. Behind them, the cathedral bells began to toll the hour, not in celebration, but in marking time, in acknowledging that some moments change everything, that some choices echo through eternity. Sarah Catherine Williams, who had been about to become Sarah Catherine Harrison, was now simply Sarah again. Sarah, walking into an uncertain future with the boy who had been her first love and the man who might be her last. And for the first time in 20 years, that felt like exactly where she was supposed to be. Epilogue. 1 year later. Sometimes the most important part of any story is what happens after the end. Sometimes the real test of love isn't in the choosing, but in the living with the choice day after day, year after year, through all the ordinary moments that make up a life. A year after Sarah walked out of her own wedding, she and Daniel were sitting on the porch of his house in Seattle, watching the sun set over Puget Sound. It was a different kind of beautiful than the life she had planned with Michael, more uncertain, more complicated, but somehow more authentically hers. They had taken it slow, just as Daniel had promised. They had dated like two adults learning each other for the first time, because in many ways, they were. The 17-year-old boy and 16-year-old girl who had loved each other so completely were still there, woven into the fabric of who they had become, but they were no longer the whole story. Daniel at 38 was quieter than he had been at 17, more thoughtful, marked by years of living under assumed names and the weight of loving someone he couldn't have. Sarah at 33 was stronger than she had been at 16, more independent, shaped by years of building a life on her own terms. They had had their first fight 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, about something small and domestic, whose turn it was to do the dishes, that escalated into something bigger about autonomy and expectations and the fear that they were trying to recreate something that belonged to their youth rather than building something that could last in their adulthood. They had broken up for 2 weeks, both of them scared that they had made a terrible mistake, that they had destroyed 2 good lives chasing a dream that was 20 years out of date. But they had found their way back to each other, humbler and more realistic but no less committed. They had learned that real love, adult love, isn't just about passion and destiny and cosmic connections. It's also about choosing each other when it's difficult, about building something together that's stronger than the sum of its parts, about growing in the same direction even when you're growing at different speeds. Do you ever regret it? Daniel asked as they watched a sailboat navigate the Sound, its white sail catching the last light of the day. Sarah knew he was asking about the wedding, about Michael, about the life she had walked away from. It was a question he asked sometimes, usually when he was feeling insecure about whether he deserved the sacrifice she had made. "No," she said, and she meant it. "I regret hurting Michael." I regret the way I handled it, the timing, the public nature of it all. But I don't regret choosing you. I don't regret choosing us. She had seen Michael once since that day, about 6 months ago, at a coffee shop in her old neighborhood. He had looked good, healthier, somehow, like a man who had grieved deeply and then found a way to move forward. He was with a woman Sarah didn't recognize, someone with kind eyes and an easy laugh who looked at Michael like he was exactly what she had been looking for. They had spoken briefly, carefully, like two people navigating around a shared wound that had mostly healed but was still tender to the touch. Michael had been gracious, forgiving, genuinely happy to see that Sarah looked well. He had told her he was glad she had found what she was looking for, and she could tell he meant it. "I'm getting married again," he had said, showing her the ring on his finger. "Her name is Jennifer. She's a teacher too. We met at a conference last spring." Sarah had felt a complex mixture of emotions, relief that he had found happiness, gratitude for his forgiveness, and a small, sharp pang of something that might have been loss or might have been nostalgia for the simple life she had turned away from. "I'm happy for you," she had said, and meant it completely. "You deserve all the love in the world, Michael." "So do you," he had replied, and squeezed her hand briefly before walking away, back to his new life, his second chance at the kind of steady, uncomplicated love that some people are meant to have. Now, sitting on Daniel's porch with his hand in hers, Sarah thought about the different kinds of love that existed in the world. There was the love she had shared with Michael, safe, comfortable, built on shared values and compatible goals and the decision to build something good together. It was real love, valuable love, the kind that made for stable marriages and happy families and contentment that lasted decades. And then there was what she had with Daniel, more complicated, more fragile, built on history and connection and the mysterious alchemy that happens when two people recognize something essential in each other. It was the kind of love that poets wrote about and that everyone hoped to find at least once in their lifetime. Neither was better than the other. They were just different, meant for different people, different stages of life, different stories. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, because he had learned to read her silences, to know when she was processing something important. "Just, how many different ways there are to love someone," Sarah said. "How many different kinds of happy endings exist." Daniel nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. It was one of the things she loved most about him, the way they could communicate in shorthand, the way 20 years of separation hadn't erased their ability to understand each other's thoughts. "Speaking of endings," Daniel said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small velvet box, "I was thinking it might be time for a new beginning." Sarah's heart stopped, then started again, beating so hard she was sure Daniel could hear it. "Daniel." "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's only been a year. I know we're still figuring things out, still learning how to be adults together instead of kids. I know that the last time you were presented with an engagement ring, it didn't end well for anyone involved." He opened the box, revealing a simple solitaire diamond, smaller than the ring Michael had given her, more understated, but somehow more perfectly suited to who she was now. "But I also know that I don't want to waste any more time," Daniel continued. "I know that I've spent 20 years without you and I don't want to spend 20 more wondering if we're going to make this official or just keep dating indefinitely. I know that what we have is real and rare and worth celebrating." He slipped off the porch swing they were sharing and knelt in front of her, the ring box open in his hands, his eyes serious and hopeful and vulnerable in a way that made her chest tight with love. "Sarah Catherine Williams," he said, and her full name in his voice was a song, a prayer, a promise. "Will you marry me? Will you take a chance on forever with me, one more time?" The sun was setting behind him, casting him in silhouette, and for a moment Sarah was 17 again, listening to a boy promise her the world under a sky full of stars. But she was also 33, old enough to know that promises are only as strong as the people making them, wise enough to understand that love isn't just about feelings but about choices made daily, hourly, moment by moment. "Yes," she said, the word coming out as barely a whisper, then louder, more certain, "Yes, of course, yes." Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, it fit perfectly, like it had been made for her, and then he was kissing her, and she was crying, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of the evening ferry heading out across the sound, carrying people home to the ones they loved. If you believe in second chances, in love that survives decades of separation, in the courage it takes to choose happiness over safety, then this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories about love that doesn't follow the rules, about people brave enough to rewrite their own endings. And tell us in the comments, do you believe some people are meant to find each other, no matter how many years or miles stand between them? They were married 6 months later, in a small ceremony on the beach behind Daniel's house. Sarah wore a simple white dress and carried wildflowers. Daniel wore a gray suit and read vows he had written that made everyone cry, including himself. There were 30 people there, mostly friends, a few family members who had forgiven Sarah for the chaos of her first almost wedding, and Emma, who served as matron of honor and cried through the entire ceremony. Michael sent a card, not to the wedding, but to their house afterward. Inside, he had written simply, "Wishing you both all the happiness you deserve. Thank you for teaching me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone go." Sarah kept the card in her jewelry box, next to the ring Michael had given her, which she had returned to him through Emma but which he had sent back with a note saying she should keep it as a reminder that she was worthy of love in all its forms. Now, 5 years after the wedding that wasn't and 4 years after the wedding that was, Sarah and Daniel were expecting their first child. Sarah was 37, which her doctor assured her was perfectly fine for a first pregnancy, though they were being cautious, monitoring everything carefully. "Do you think we'll be good parents?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat in the nursery they were preparing, Daniel assembling a crib while Sarah folded tiny clothes that seemed impossibly small. "I think we'll figure it out as we go," Daniel said, looking up from the instruction manual with a smile. "I think we'll make mistakes and learn from them and love this baby so much it won't matter that we don't know what we're doing." Sarah placed a hand on her still small belly, marveling at the life growing inside her, at the miracle of second chances and new beginnings and love that was patient enough to wait 20 years for the right moment. Sometimes the best stories don't end with happily ever after. Sometimes they end with happily ever beginning, with people brave enough to keep writing new chapters, to keep believing in love even when it's complicated, even when it asks them to give up other kinds of happiness, even when it requires more courage than they knew they possessed. Sarah's story didn't end when she walked out of that cathedral. It began again, with a choice that changed everything, with a love that proved some things are worth waiting for, with the understanding that the heart knows things the mind can't always explain. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough. Thank you for joining us for another Love Stories episode. If this tale of second chances and impossible choices moved you, please share it with someone who believes in the power of love to rewrite our stories. Subscribe to our channel for more emotionally rich tales of love in all its complicated, beautiful forms. And remember, your own love story is still being written. The next chapter might be the one that changes everything.